This is the new TC Pride Podcast, Episode 31, Part 2 of 2016 Election Issues with Beth Zemsky. Hello and welcome to the Twin Cities Pride Podcast. I'm here with our special guest, Beth Zemsky. You said that there was one more issue that you wanted to discuss.
Back in earlier in our own movement, the 70s, 80s, 90s, certainly through HIV, police brutality was something that was way up on the LGBT agenda. And we wanted police accountability task force. When I worked for Out Front, this was something that we worked hard on, was getting to police to be accountable in terms of their own misogyny and homophobia and their mistreatment of our community, particularly trans people. And I think that's one of the intersections between the LGBT community and Black Lives Matter. It's trans people of color that are getting more victims of hate crimes, but they're also more likely to be victimized by police. And just FYI, the three African-American women who started Black Lives Matter were three queer women.
I don't think most people would know that.
Right. And the Movement for Black Lives, which is sort of the national group and movement, and then there are Black Lives Matter chapters everywhere. Their sort of document of what they're after is one of the most inclusive documents of LGBT folks that I've ever seen. So what is center to the Movement Black Lives is an understanding of the intersectionality of race and sexuality and gender identity. And I think that for us, for me as somebody in the white LGBT community, I need to raise to the level of understanding and intersectionality that they've put out. That there's not, Black Lives Matter included Black queer lives. And how do we make sure that's top of the agenda? Right.
I mean, and the other thing, too, I just wanted to ask you about, since you mentioned it, you have been involved being an advocate for LGBTQ rights for a long time. What are some ways you'd say that, like, being an advocate for the community has changed over the years?
So one of the things I think is that, and I believe, is that movements need different things from an organizer at different movement moments. So when I think, for example, at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, when we felt like nobody was listening to us, nobody cared about the hundreds of thousands of people who were dying, we really needed to take to the streets, and we needed to be disruptive. So just as sort of an aside, when sometimes I talk to people my age, white, older LGBT people, and they're like, well, why are Black Lives Matter taking over 94? And I'm like, do you remember in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic when we took over Wall Street? Do you remember when we closed down St. Patrick's Cathedral and we threw blood on the altar? Do you remember when we lay down in the middle of Fifth Avenue and stalled traffic? Right? So there are moments when things are critical in movements where it is about disruption. It's about getting folks to notice an issue that they're not going to notice any other way. And so I think it depends on what happens next, whether we, as the LGBT movement, needs to have that as a primary tactic. Clearly, Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, they're in a moment like that. Right? They're in a life and death moment where tactics like that are important. Clearly, I think that it's important to vote. One of my own beliefs is that elected officials are not necessarily social change leaders. They often are able to enact policy once activists and advocates create a public conversation that helps them then sort of get it and pass the bill. So we have a lot of work to do to continue to not only can do lobbying of legislatures, but keep a public conversation going that our lives matter, that these issues matter. And sometimes that's about using the same strategies we used in the marriage campaign, which is, talking about our lives in ways that are very direct, connecting with people. Because we told our stories once about love and commitment, doesn't mean we should stop, because the general public thinks everything's okay, and they don't get that hate crimes are still happening and trans women of color are still getting murdered and our rights are potentially jeopardized by these religious freedom restoration acts. And so I think we need to continue to do the tactics that worked in the marriage campaign on a one-to-one basis, as well as lobbying and all that other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that brings me to a couple of questions. One, I guess we've established what some of the major problems are right now, or some of the major work that still needs to be done, and some of the things that need to be accomplished. I guess I wanted to ask you, okay, so like from your kind of unique perspective, being involved for a long time, what are some solutions, maybe some creative solutions? And then also, I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about how important it is to remember kind of how things used to be and how things had been accomplished in the past. What are some maybe resources that you would direct people to kind of learn about the way things used to be?
Well, there are some great videos out there, like Before Stonewall, After Stonewall, Out of the Past. All of those are available actually from the library. In addition, little self-promotion plug, Dave Mann and I did a workshop this morning for the Kaleo Center around understanding this election through movement eyes. And sometime in the spring, we're going to do a full day. So that'll be a sort of full day about thinking about sort of how do we understand the political times we're in using sort of social change, social movement theory. But there's thankfully a ton of LGBT history around, and there's Rebecca Lawrence has a thing called Telling Queer History, and it's a storytelling thing that happens once a month in the Twin Cities. So I know there's a Facebook page for that project, so people can go on that, and it's just great. I mean, she has people coming once a month and telling different parts of our community history. Let me mention one more. Ann Hodson is in the middle of creating a video of the history of the Twin Cities Pride.
Right. And actually, you were actually featured in the video that they showed at the Grand Marshal ceremony, the awards ceremony.
Yeah.
So
I was Grand Marshal in '96.
Oh, okay. All right. And then, so like we've established what some of the major kind of pressing issues are. What would you say are maybe some of the, some of the paths forward, or maybe some of the creative solutions in sort of pursuing some of these things that need to be accomplished?
So if I think back about the history of our movement and other successful movements, the thing about movements is they move.
Okay.
Okay. And they often move by using both an insider and outsider strategy. So we now have folks like Karen Clark and Scott Dibble who are elected, Tammy Baldwin at the national level, senator from Wisconsin who are out. There's other out candidates. So, great. Let's continue to get folks elected. Let's continue to get progressive heterosexual, cisgender folks elected that are able to speak to our issues. Let's get a good Supreme Court, work inside the system, because we worked for years to get into the system. And at the same time, people in the system are not going to be able to do their work unless we continue to do good organizing. And what I mean by good organizing is not just in terms of campaigns, but it's really being able to get involved in issue campaigns, get involved in Out Front, get involved in any one of the LGBT organizations that are really doing cultural change, that are talking about our lives in ways that people are not used to hearing. We're complex people, and they get a sliver of us, and mostly they get how we're supposedly just like them, which we're not. And Trump, or Trumpism, has given people license again to hate and be public about their hate. And we need to keep, and even when it's not us, it's heterosexual Muslims, it's Syrian immigrants, it's whoever it is if we continue to live in a country where people have license to hate, the hate will be focused on us too. And also, it just on a personal level, that violates my deepest held values. I don't want to be in a community where anybody has license to hate.
Right. So when Orlando happened, right? I mean, that's actually where we met, was at that event. And I was actually really moved by so many people that said that we can't turn against each other. Like, we can't turn against, for example, like the Muslim community.
So I actually think, just to pick up on that, it's even more than we can't turn on each other. I think for those of us who've managed to come out, we have something very special to sort of provide to the world. So rather than thinking about us as victims here, we've got something the world needs, because we know the power of love, commitment, and desire as a transformational fact. Because we changed our lives in order to have authentic relationships, love, desire, passion. I don't just mean physical. I mean passion for the world, passion for stuff. We change. We for those of us who manage to come out, we risk giving up everything in order to live an authentic life, to have authentic relationships that were centered in love. Right? Now that is a transformational power that our communities need, particularly right now. So if we really were out there kind of talking about our lives and we're centered in our own transformational power, it's like that's just not a coming out thing. That's not just something we did in order to come out. That's something like a lot of us went through a lot of crap to be able to say, no, authentic relationships and love is more important than the society rules that are keeping me in this box that I'm supposed to hate myself and hate you.
Absolutely. And so I guess there's just one more question I want to ask you too. When we spoke with Congressman Keith Ellison just not too long ago, I asked him like how important elections are and being involved in the process is to members of the LGBTQ community. He said that for people that maybe feel that they don't want to go vote or be involved because they feel the system is corrupt or it doesn't maybe represent them. He said, like we said, that not voting isn't protesting, it's surrendering. What would you say to members of the LGBT community or any other community who might feel that the system is corrupt or doesn't represent them and that their involvement in the process isn't important or that their voice doesn't matter?
So I have two things to say. One is, I guess, the obvious, that it's never going to represent us if we're not involved in it.
Okay.
And the second thing is the framing of this as now, don't get me wrong. I think there's a big problem with politics and money, particularly since Citizens United, which if it was overturned, we'd maybe have a chance of getting back to something sane, which is another Supreme Court issue. Having said that, the framing of politics being corrupt, the right, that framing has been put forth by the right. In order to, Reagan said in 1980, government's not the solution, it's the problem. And since then, every major institution of civil society has been under attack by the right. Our schools, our government, our tax system, anything that we sort of think of as civil society that has kept us together as a community, the right has attacked it. Health insurance, right?
Sure, yeah.
And part of their agenda is small government or no government, so that we could sort of have radical individualism. It's my money, right? So I could give you a bazillion examples, but the overall thing is that when we buy that everything is rigged and we should just check out because it's all rigged,
right?
It's fitting right into the narrative that they have put out, that civil society, that there is no such thing as civil society, and there is no such thing as institutions that we can invest in order to be in community with each other. And I just don't buy that. And the more we repeat it, the more we make it true.
All right. Well, thank you very much for making some time for us. I figured you'd be super busy this last week before the election, so thanks for making some time for the Twin Cities Pride podcast. And hopefully, we can sit down and talk.
Always happy to do it.
Soon. Great.
Okay,
thanks so much, Beth. The TC Pride podcast has been a production of Podletter Media and Twin Cities Pride. Subscribe now on iTunes or Google Play and submit your first Pride story at myfirstpride.org.